From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
About 80% of what we do in response to any threat is the same. There's only a small percentage, I'll call it 20%, that's unique to that particular crisis. And yet, we don't spend the time on that 80% so that we are prepared for whatever comes. And we use instead the excuse that we didn't know the hurricane was going to come that day.
That was General Stan McChrystal talking about his new book, Risk, A User's Guide. Tony, you and I got a chance to have a really fascinating conversation with General McChrystal and then his co-author, Anna Butrico. What surprised you about the conversation?
It was terrific. I mean, this is a guy who has such rich experience in the national security space. And what I loved about our discussion and the book is the breadth of the assessment of risk and the lessons for it and how they apply to so many areas of life. We talked about the Fosbury flop and the financial crisis, and there's a lot in there for if you are running an organization today, the kinds of lessons that you get from this and from the interview that Stan and Anna were able to discuss to apply to the way you're running your organization.
Yeah, it's well written. It's super accessible, right? So you can be a CEO and read this, or you can be somebody lower in the organization thinking about and observing leadership and thinking about your own leadership path. But it's a book that, it quotes Coco Chanel, the special forces in Afghanistan, Mother Nature, talks about Ferraris, The Wizard of Oz, Google. It's got a lot of good.
Yeah, you should get, when you get this book and you read it, you should be prepared to write in the margin and fold over, ears on the pages to go back to, because it's just filled with those kinds of lessons that you want to keep track of and be able to go back into and remind yourself of. And I think a lot of that came out in the interview we just had. And all right, I hope you all stick around and listen to this. It's a terrific interview.
So here's our conversation with General Stanley McChrystal and his co-author, Anna Butrico, on their new book, Risk, A User's Guide. General Stan McChrystal, Anna Butrico, thank you so much for joining us on HPS Insights.
Well, thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're looking forward to the conversation with both of you, Tony and I. And I want to jump right in because here you've co-authored a book on risk, put it into the world 18, 20 months into a global pandemic. Was that coincidence, or were you working on this and thinking about it before the pandemic?
Well, Anna saw the pandemic coming. She knew exactly what was going to happen. No, the reality was we wanted to write a book. Anna had been working in McChrystal Group, and then she'd been my speechwriter. And I was very impressed with what she did. And I knew we wanted to write a book. And I'd been really, I want to say intrigued, but really perplexed by the question of risk over a lifetime. And the question was really around, why do we get it wrong so often? We study it, we've been trained about it, and then we drop the ball way too often. And so I was intrigued to study risk to see if we could learn more. And I thought Anna was the perfect partner to write the book with. And so we in advance of COVID-19, but I think we're in about the first month when the pandemic began.
Yeah, and I remember there was a distinct conversation that we had. I think it was around in February. We were still in the office, and I remember we sat in your office, and you said, this book's going to be about COVID-19. And COVID-19 I think there were a few cases in the United States. It was a distant but scary threat. But immediately we switched our focus, and really the argument that we had sort of been building throughout January ended up proving itself with COVID, especially as a crescendo then got louder and louder, and we ended up writing from our homes. So ended up proving what we thought and actually reinforcing it in the process.
It seems like the truth is that, as you look over the past few decades, and you don't have to wait very long to find a risk failure, do you? There seems, whether it's, we had, things like the Asian financial crisis in the 90s. We have numerous security related events that have happened preceding 9/11, then 9/11, and since then we've had 2 financial crises since then, and a couple of we think of the COVID epidemic. We've had a few others, SARS and Ebola as well. I mean, there are a lot of risk events that end up on our doorstep, and it's only when it's quiet you get nervous knowing that one is coming.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because many of them are so knowable. Yeah. Meaning, Hurricane Katrina wasn't the first hurricane to hit the Gulf Coast of the United States. It won't be the last, and it in many ways was like hurricanes before and after it, and yet we dropped the ball so completely with a threat that's known, and we actually knew what to do about it. And so, Tony, as you described, there were countless examples of threats that we should have been able to see clearly. Maybe we don't know the exact time or nature of that particular threat, but we know that they are inevitable. And so we ought to be really good at dealing with them.
Yeah.
And that is your thesis, right? Or as you said, Anna, the argument you were putting together is really, that our greatest risk is ourselves, and that you all say we're focused far too much on what may happen and not enough on the factors that are contributing to that.
Yeah, I like to think of it as often we focus on that big bad wolf that's knocking on the door, that external threat or the hazard that poses a risk to you, rather than the tools inside your house as that wolf attempts to blow it down. So if we think of risk as that product of threats, that big bad wolf and vulnerabilities, the tools in your house, people focus on the wolf. They're always looking outward and not inward. And as threats continue to shift and change, COVID-19 being a prime example, Delta variant, Omicron variant, we're going to get to the Zeta variant probably very soon if we go through the Greek alphabet. Right. We can't keep up with the evolving threat, so the vulnerability piece needs to be the focus.
And I think sometimes what we use is an excuse that we didn't expect a certain threat for our failure. And yet, if you look back, if you take a range of failures, whether it's 9/11, the terrorist attacks, or it's the 2008 financial crisis, or COVID-19, or Hurricane Katrina, about 80% of what we do in response to any threat is the same. We have to communicate well. We have to have a clear narrative. We have to act. We have to get the timing right. There has to be leadership. There's only a small percentage, I'll call it 20%, that's unique to that particular crisis. And yet we don't spend the time on that 80% so that we are prepared for whatever comes. And we use instead the excuse that we didn't know the hurricane was going to come that day.
Yeah, you generally do know. I mean, I think it was one of the things I really like about the book. And by the way, the book is. I loved reading through it because it as someone who was a practitioner in government dealing with a lot of crises, it's a terrific user's guide, and we deal with crises with firms and others right now in the same way. It's a great way to think about how to anticipate problems, assess them, be ready for them, and train others to do it. One of the issues that you talk about is that the fact that, as you were referring to, that information is available ahead of time. You have the signal, and the huge challenge of trying to two problems I see: either distinguishing the signal from the noise, like one signal in a blizzard of signals. But also looking at the same things. And I'll tell you from my experience from the financial crisis, it wasn't that people didn't see that what was going on in the housing sector and that it was a problem. There was a misunderstanding of that the nature of the problem. And if you look at CDOs, I can tell you the prevailing view among top financial policy officials at the time was that things like CDOs were seen as insurance policies on distributing risk in ways that were intended to mitigate risk. So people were looking at the same set of facts and saying, actually this should minimize the the disruption, and instead, it acted as a carrier of contagion. It was contagion that was going through the financial system. So looking at the same set of facts but coming to different conclusions, I think is an issue as well. And you talked about it with the 9/11, preceding 9/11 as well.
Yes, it's a failure across a range of factors. So it's not one thing that caused the financial crash of 2008. It wasn't one thing that caused the 9/11 failure to predict and prevent. It wasn't one thing that caused COVID-19. It's a product of a variety of different risk control factors, which are things that we have the ability to influence, but are weak. So in the cases that you just described, Tony, there was a structural problem. Lehman Brothers did have a chief risk officer, but they buried them in the organization and that they didn't give them the authority or ability to assess risk. Yeah. In the case of 9/11, communication signals were not assessed. They weren't passed with the right narrative in mind. So we have narrative and communication at play. There's biases of how we want to interpret information. All of them kind of make up what we call a risk immune system, but they work together to create sometimes a inefficient or an ineffective response to risk.
I love the concept of the risk immune system, as you all as you've written about it, because I think it makes so much sense. Because risk, you want. You don't want to completely eliminate risk. I mean, we need risk. We need people taking risk. We need financial institutions taking risk. We don't want to put money in a warehouse, right? We need to put money at risk in order to create growth and investment. Everybody needs to be taking risks. But the idea of a risk immune system, could you guys just explain how you think of that concept a little bit?
Well, I'll start where we got it from. I had a work on counterinsurgency, obviously, when I was in active duty. And I had a young Yale immunologist came to visit me in my office at Yale and said, I think the human immune system is like counterinsurgency. And I said, well, I don't know anything about the human immune system. Do you know anything about counterinsurgency? She said, just enough to think there's a comparison. And so what we did is we studied it. We put together a presentation, and I became more impressed with what the human immune system does. And then when we started looking at risk, we started thinking about the human immune system is what helps us fend off or deal with the threats that come at us. And when you think about what it does for the human body, which ingests about 10,000 microorganisms a day, any one of which could kill us or at least make us sick, it becomes pretty darn important. And we started thinking about how an organization or society deals with it. Really, it was Anna who goes, all right, this human immune system really connects to the idea of what an organization, and a society is just a big organization, does it. If you'll take that, Anna.
And COVID-19, we're in the thick of COVID-19 at this point. So we were obsessed with the idea of making our human immune systems as strong as possible. And so we thought, okay, what 4 things does a human immune system do? It detects threats. So in the case of COVID-19, it would say, this is a virus that is unfamiliar to me. It assesses them based on our own vulnerabilities. So we had no natural immunity to COVID. So the threat of COVID became a risk to us in our lives. We respond to it. So in the case of COVID, you get a fever, you get that horrible cough, you get loss of smell and taste. And then you learn, you build up immunity, you build up antibodies so that hopefully the next time that COVID-19 comes your way, you're stronger to defend against it. So we said, similarly, organizations have those 4 imperatives to really strengthen their risk immune system, to detect threats, assess them, respond to them, and learn. And so the system becomes stronger and stronger. As we transition through the pandemic, we see people developing immunity, and we hope too that organizations can strengthen their own responses to risk as a result.
So let's talk about, you identify the 10 risk control factors that are going into our risk immune system. And one thing that struck me is they're not rocket science, with all due respect, right? They're things, and that's what makes the book accessible also. But I wondered what was the process of getting to those 10? And I was thinking, is one of these going to be any more important? And I think the point that you say in the book is that they're all important.
So we iterated towards 10 risk control factors. We had played with the idea of having more than 10. We had fewer than 10, but we knew from the beginning that communication was going to be a foundational factor and that it had to connect and create a system. And that leadership was obviously very important and was that center of the system, kind of that center of gravity that brought it all together. So we knew we had those two, and those really bookend the risk control factors in the book. But we worked through different ones. Diversity became really important as we studied President Kennedy's Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. We really leaned into that. We thought about bias, which often is really close to diversity. We thought about a bias for action, and we leaned into an action focus of how you act or when you don't. In communication, that built into narrative, how we tell the stories, not just telling them. So then that kind of expanded into its own risk control factor. So kind of over and over, we discussed it and thought about all different facets of risk, really using COVID-19 as a guide of how we were succeeding or failing in responses and really exploring from there.
I want to jump in on one of them. And I was, one thing that struck me in when you all are talking about diversity and General McChrystal was, you were reflective of how the diversity of opinions and different opinions has shaped your life, not just at this point in your career, but at all different stages, and really about how people are creating a better product when we think differently than each other. As we say, the beauty's in the mix, right? In our business, the beauty's in the mix. So I wonder, talk a little bit about General McChrystal about diversity in the context of risk.
Stacy, please call me Stan.
Okay.
Yeah. Diversity is a really interesting one to me because there's a tendency to confuse diversity with gender or age or race. Right. And that's kind of superficial. The reality is you can have diversity in those and not have diversity of perspectives. If everybody's had the same experiences and backgrounds, you get the same view. And so what I found, my personal experience in the counterterrorist fight, our counterterrorist forces were remarkably not diverse when I grew up. In fact, we had selection processes that actually selected for certain things, which decreased the chance of diversity. Then when we got in the height of the fight in Iraq, we found we needed to become a meritocracy, particularly on special skills, intelligence, communications, and whatnot. So we started bringing in people with different backgrounds, and they looked different. They were different ages and all this. And it started to become much better place because what we'd done is we'd open the doors and windows and we were getting different views in there, a more holistic focus on the problem. As Anna talked, we studied the Bay of Pigs and the President Kennedy. He's got a group of old white guys because that was 1961 US government. But the reality is he also didn't have a diversity of perspectives. They all sort of looked at the problem the same. And in fact, after that, a man named Irvin Janis coined the name groupthink, the term groupthink. Yep. And you all get in the wrong direction because you don't open the doors and windows and improve it. And I think all organizations now have got to look for that. It's got to be an intentional effort to get people in the room who'll see it different. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted Anna to write the book with me. She's a different gender. She's a different generation. She's had a different life journey. And so I knew when we looked at case studies, I was going to come with a certain set of biases because I'd lived through a lot of them. Yeah, biases, and Anna was going to come with a fresh set of eyes.
It seems to me it's one of the hardest things to do, right? Because what you're trying to, what you're hoping to get from the diversity of views is the ability to adapt, and you focus on that in the book, and it ends up being obvious to everyone I end up talking to that I'm a Pittsburgh guy, and so I love to see the Pittsburgh parts of the book, both in terms of growing up in Pittsburgh. I didn't need to relearn General Braddock's fate as he was heading to Fort Duquesne, but also the call out you have on how Pittsburgh changed during that period, which I actually worked on 25 and years ago, and before coming back to Washington in the Bush administration, worked very closely on all of that work that helped Pittsburgh adapt. But that adaptability, the ability to deal with change, I think is really, that's the thing that you're looking for, right? Because you cannot keep doing the same things because the world is dynamic, right?
Yeah, I became obsessed with Pittsburgh. I remember there was a dark time in April during the pandemic when day in and day out, when I wasn't doing much during COVID, I just studied Pittsburgh relentlessly. So it's this big joke to my family, and I was here with my family during the pandemic, that I needed to go to Pittsburgh. It was some like holy retreat because I.
Well, Tony's going to give you a big list, Anna. Tony's going to give you a full itinerary.
We'll talk, Tony. But yeah, what was really interesting about Pittsburgh is that adaptability. We say it requires a willingness and an ability to change with shifting conditions. Pittsburgh was both willing and able. It really leaned on the natural resources around the city of rivers. They really leaned into the universities that were around. They made an intentional effort to bring business in and tourists in, where Flint, Michigan, which we use as a comparison, didn't do it as much. So that the willingness is one part, the ability is another. And if you don't have both, it's impossible.
Yeah, you definitely need both, and the focus on it. And there was one other element of adaptation also, which it was really fascinating to me as a former, was a high school high jumper, and it never occurred to me until I read it in the book about the Fosbury flop, which is not what I expected to be reading about in your book about risk. But it was really illustrative, and that is the idea that changing environments, changing conditions can inspire adaptive changes that can be incredibly disruptive. Also, and so as I say, I looked at how people were high jumping and said, "Wow, this is really innovative. This guy Fosbury came up with a different way to do it." But it was the technology of the landing that allowed for adaptation to happen. And I just thought there was a really, I don't know if it was an original observation, but I thought it was a really, illustrative one.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the landing pad changed for everybody.
Right.
But only Dick Fosbury figures out, hey, I won't break my neck. Now I can try something different. In my military experience, what I found was doctrine was often limiting. You create doctrine of how things should be done or procedures in any organization. And if your people before you or your peers are all doing it a certain way, there's a safety in doing what they do, even if you fail. Because, I followed the manual, I followed the doctrine, I did this, but I failed. And you say, so it's really not my fault. And so what I would argue is someone like Dick Fosbury could have stayed with the old technique and lost. And he says, I did my best. I did it like all the other smart people are doing it.
Yeah.
Instead, what he did was he had the ability mentally to say, I'm going to take a chance. Because if he had failed terribly using that new technique, there are a lot of people who would have said, you failed because you didn't do the proven way.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good lesson for leaders in all organizations.
It really is. And it's, and I think it's the greatest trick. I mean, when I know you spend a lot of time talking to, corporations and CEOs about how they try to solve these things. And I think it's incredibly daunting for, to be a CEO today. I mean, like it's really tough to get, organization, culture well, to get information well, you as a general or as a CEO to say, you need to be getting information. Well, you can get too much information, how you get it, the priority of it, the clarity of it, then what do you do with it? I think is really daunting. The talent piece of it, the things that places fall into is, someone comes into your organization and succeeds, you say, we need to get more of those kinds of people because they're succeeding. And so you think that's the right thing, right? But then you're not getting diversity of views, right? You almost want to have a situation where you could have some people who are going to, try out people who might fail because you want to have the opportunity for them to potentially succeed too, right?
Yeah. I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit here because if you think about going to write a book, what I could have done is getting a person my age who's been a ghostwriter for 8 books and write the book with them, and then would have probably been hit the easy button. But we'd have produced something within a certain limited range. And instead, by having a co-author, a full co-author with a completely different set of talents, you get a very different book. And is there risk in that? I didn't personally think there was much risk in that, but you could see people tend to stay in the same wagon rut because it's comfortable and it's viewed as risk-free.
More people in your position, Stan, should do it because I do think, it's like I think Anna, I think you come through in the book, in the book, if that's not obvious, because if you've seen, read, previous work by General McChrystal, I think this is a different book.
Let's talk a little bit about a little behind the scenes of the process of that. So Anna, you come to the McChrystal Group as a speechwriter, right? Did you come as a speechwriter?
As a consultant, actually. So I interned at McChrystal Group in college, and I was on the consulting side of the business. So I was at an oil and gas company for my first year or so at McChrystal Group, and then transitioned to speechwriting after then. So I've seen the consulting side, but I have a background in English. So now you become Stan's speechwriter, and then take us behind this. Like, are you thinking, Stan, I'm planning to write this book and I'm looking for somebody to write it with me, or were you intentional? This is not your first book, Stan, and it is yours, Anna. So what was the intention behind it, and how did that process work?
Yeah, and this is an interesting story because I wanted Anna to be the speechwriter because I knew she was bright and she had some background in communications, and so doing really well in the company. But also we went on this McChrystal Group leadership venture where we went and did orienteering for 2 days, and it was wickedly cold. And we went out to Western Virginia. We do these every quarter to different rock climbing and things like that. And so Anna's on my 4-person team as we've got to do this set of orientation points. And she is breaking brush. She's the one leading us. She's got a compass and she's hacking her way like Daniel Boone through the woods. And it was amazing. And essentially, here I am, grew up doing that stuff, and I'm just following her. And I said at the end of this, here's somebody with grit. And I don't usually use that term because we were wicked cold and she does this. And that made an impression. And then you add that to the intellectual part on speechwriting. When it was time to write the book, I said, well, I want to write it with somebody, one, I respect and I like, because writing is an intensely collaborative affair. Yeah. You just don't want to take a trip like this with somebody you don't like. But also somebody I thought would be very strong, would work hard. And so that was my reason. And Anna, of course, I don't know why you accepted.
And what was that? Yeah, I want to know why you accepted, but what was that? Did he say, hey, I'm thinking about this and why don't you do it with me? And did that tell us?
Yeah, the speech writing was an amazing experience. I do remember that walk through the woods. I remember if it said you walk 40 paces in Northeast, I mean, if there was a bush, I would walk through the bush. I mean, it's a little bit of psychotic behavior, but I said, okay, I will do as told. Which is funny in retrospect. So I really enjoyed the speech writing. I thought it was really fascinating to build something with someone of influence and be able to contribute and be able to give some ideas and have them received positively and iterate together. So I learned a lot really quickly. When the book opportunity came up, I remember Stan actually invited my significant other of many years over for dinner and said that one of the previous authors of the book was also in town. He helped write Team of Teams. Mm-hmm. And Stan said, listen, let's talk to Teddy. Let's see what he had thought about his process writing Team of Teams. But this is a decision that you and your partner are going to make because it's going to be a long 2-year process. So I really enjoyed and respected that decision to kind of bring us all together in the room. We had a really interesting, long conversation on writing, on life, doing a book, on what we think the next book needs to be in the McChrystal Group canon of literature. Now, this is being one of its books. So we had a really interesting discussion. As soon as that dinner ended, I said, I mean, this is just the opportunity of a lifetime. And it was the greatest honor and excitement I've ever had. So I enjoyed every minute, all the fact checking, all of the writing, you name it.
That's great. I mean, I have to say, like, I am, I have such respect for speechwriters. But I think speechwriting is different from the book because as a speechwriter, you're writing in, in someone else's voice. which is why I hate speech writing. I'm not good at it because I like my own voice. And so I'm too attached to my own voice and my own thoughts and my own way of presenting information. So being able to do it for someone else, it seems like the book is more in both of your, it's a joint voice. As I read the book, I'm trying not to read it in Stan's voice.
Yeah. And Tony, you're exactly right. This book was not written. I mean, there are a few places where we put my voice. And to be honest, the editor said there's a few places you got to do that because that's what certain readers want. We originally wanted to put we on almost everything except it was certain personal experiences.
Yes.
And it wasn't like me coming up with the idea and then saying, here, Anna, write it. It wasn't me. What we did was we sat down and we said we want to study risk because we didn't have a thesis. We didn't agree upon this is what we're going to say about risk. Now we started with the idea we want to write about risk. What's the problem? And we had this big whiteboard and we put down a bunch of examples in life where risk has been an issue, things I could think of, things around, and then we studied more. As we put those, that started to let us come up with the risk control factors. As we started to study those, the thesis started to appear. It started to tell us this is really what we believe about risk. The greatest risk to us is us. Yeah. And the way we would work, and of course, after about 3 months, COVID separated us. We went about a year without physically seeing each other, except obviously video calls. But it was a case of we'd each write chapters, exchange those chapters, edit each other's work, do it again, do it repeatedly until we're getting a voice that is comfortable for both of us and perspectives. And we'd argue through conclusions of what did it really mean? And when Blockbuster failed, what's the lesson there? What was the cause and the lesson? And that was very interesting. Particularly, it gets to the generational differences because some of those I'd remembered. And that sort of tainted my memory because I'd read it in the news. And Anna could look at it more detached on the earlier ones. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, it was like the 2008 financial crisis. I was 13. So it's just interesting how we built sort of that together. Having a very different memory of events, having grown up learning about it in a textbook is very different from having experienced it. So that was really interesting. And we'd iterate together towards the final draft. I mean, we would iterate. We had, I think, 52 versions of chapter 10 at the end. I mean, we were very meticulous about tracking each version. Mm-hmm. So we did at the end, which was really helpful, read everything aloud. So we read the entire book together aloud when we finally were safe to collaborate. And that really helped in the end to iterate towards that final voice that we agreed on. So I found that to be especially helpful. It took many hours to read it. We printed out all the pages on a big table and just stood there for a week or so at a time. Yeah. And that really was, I think, the final production of the voice.
Tony and I spent time overlapping at in different parts of government. And I think it is always sort of a special reflection when you have been in the room and then people are writing about those experiences. And so I learned a lot from some of those rooms that I was sitting in, and your lessons sort of enhanced my memory from being there at the time and then reflecting back. So.
Well, you guys would appreciate this. I was in the Pentagon. I'd come out of Iraq in the summer of 2008. I'd just gotten to the Pentagon. I was director of the Joint Staff, and Larry Summers came over to brief the 4 stars. I was the 3-star, but I'm in the room to tell us, hey, we got a big problem here. and I remember thinking, I wonder how big a problem this is. And I sort of said, if he's over here telling us we got a big problem, I bet it's a big problem.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Larry was right. I mean, but how big it was. I think that's the you could see a monster around every corner, right? I mean, it is right, and so you do have to be careful about that. And I do think that's the challenge. I'd love to just hear that for thinking about the next thing, right? Like we can always look at. There are a lot of Titanics back there, right? To look at the Titanic, they didn't think they were being risky, right? They thought the opposite. of it. So how do we think about if you're going to have sort of the lesson for going forward, besides read this book, and I'm going to keep telling people to read this book because it's going to introduce ideas, but it's like, how should we be looking at that next thing? And I'll throw one example out there. If you're a CEO right now in America, certainly a government official, if you're a CEO in America right now, you should be thinking about if there's a Taiwan event, what does that mean to me, for example, right? It's one of those things we could see potentially coming in some form or another, and they had better have a plan. What's the right way to think about that, and what do you do?
Andy, you want to start?
Sure. So I think the one major takeaway is separate from your example that you just offered, and that how I have been thinking about it and talking about it, is that risk is not a pejorative. It's an opportunity. So we think of it as, I've said the big bad wolf, you name it, give it that big, scary idea. Instead, risk is a very complicated intersection of that bad thing and then what you have to prevent against it. So if you look inward, not outward, you can't avoid looking outward. Obviously, you need to keep pace with threats as they evolve. But if the reference is shifted, that's the important first step. And I think looking at it as something to control, to learn more about, to get in that driver's seat makes you feel less powerless, and also diverts your attention to productive things you can change. So that would be my advice, spinning risk on its head to be not a pejorative, but an opportunity.
And I would follow that up by saying the things that give you the opportunity to take advantage of opportunities are basic abilities to communicate, the ability to act very quickly, the ability, the courage for leaders to make decisions and move, getting that breadth of diverse thoughts. It's all things that give you capacity for rapid adaptability that allow you to deal with those threats. And when everybody else isn't dealing with them well, as you know from the financial world, those people who have their act together prosper. The same thing happens in war, in combat. If your enemy has a problem and you're still cohesive, you really can take advantage of that. And so the idea is staying cohesive, being effective, being resilient is the popular term, and I think it's correct.
Yeah.
Let's end on this question, and I want to get your perspectives. Stan, from your clients and the CEOs that you're sitting with and the people that you're working with, what are they telling you the hardest part is right now? What is hard for them? Because this all seems, you lay it out so well, but it's easier said than done. So what in this moment, in the end of 2021, what do they see as the hardest thing to do?
Yeah, I would say the common thing, or the most common thing I hear, is to get their teams to operate with as much initiative and accept as much risk as they want them to. And that's interesting, because they say it's not a case of not wanting to get junior people to accept risk and act, but getting them to do that. And sometimes they think that if they stay at the top and they put out an edict that says everybody accept risk, people will do it. But in reality, people look and see what happens if you have a failure or that sort of thing. So it's creating a different environment to loosen that. And I think CEOs are figuring it out. And I think the virtual world makes it harder, because it's harder to be bold when you are sitting in your own living room and you've got nobody to look left and right to, no comrades to ask, hey, what do you think? Because you feel more alone. Agreed. And so how do we decrease that sense of vulnerability so we can get people to act faster?
It's such a great point. I hadn't thought about that piece of it, but I think that's exactly right. I've been thinking about the remoteness from a learning standpoint, but getting a confidence to go do things. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's much better in person than it is remote. I think you feel better about it. Stan McChrystal and Anna Butrico, I can't tell you how much it meant to us to have you join us today. It's really, really wonderful. The book is terrific. I do hope people read it. I do think there's so many lessons in it, and I appreciate the time you've spent with us today on this.
You're kind to have us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
An important conversation to end the year. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.